All right, this is a little mini lecture that's going to dive a little bit deeper into trans identities and bodies and body work. And just before we start, I want to let you all know that in this little lecture, I will be speaking both from various research about trans identities, but also from my own experiences as a transgender identified person and the many people in the community who I know or have worked with in the past. And so I want to just also offer up as a space that you are welcome to engage with me about, to ask about my own experience as a trans person, if you have questions or if you have more questions about the material in general. So we're going to start with a little bit of a trans 101, and you'll hear me throughout the lecture use trans as a shorthand for transgender. Those two terms are relatively interchangeable at this point and acceptable to use. And so transgender is really just an umbrella term for people who don't fit our normative idea of how bodies and sex, biological sex, fit together with gender identity. So the presumption that people who are assigned male at birth will identify as men, and people who are assigned female at birth will identify as women, that logic, that cultural logic, doesn't always work for everyone. In fact, doesn't work for a lot of people. And so that's just sort of the basic understanding of what a transgender person is. There are other categories of folks who may identify with the trans community. So somebody who is intersex, that refers to the biological body, maybe doesn't quote unquote fit our understanding of the male-female binary. And so that might be for a variety of reasons related to hormones or chromosomes or external genital appearance or other factors. And some intersex people, but not all, will also identify as trans. When we're using terms like trans man, that is a person who identifies as a man, but was perhaps assigned female at birth, whereas a trans woman would be somebody who was assigned male at birth and identifies as a woman. So when we say trans man or trans woman, that is the identity that they feel is authentic to them, not necessarily the one that they were assigned. And these definitions that we're going to be talking about are all very basic. So just like cisgender or non-transgender people, trans folks all experience their identities very uniquely, and no one trans person is going to be representative of the entire community. At the same time, not all trans people are identified with binary gender options, and not everyone is just interested in switching sides, quote unquote. So folks who are assigned male at birth are not necessarily just interested in being women, and vice versa. Some folks don't feel identified with the gender binary. Those folks may identify as non-binary, which itself is another umbrella term. And so folks who identify as non-binary might identify with any number of different relationships to gender that just aren't mapped onto the binary of man or woman. And when we're thinking about transgender, we're thinking about gender, identity, and perhaps gender expression, which doesn't necessarily mean that if somebody chooses to transition, whether that's socially, medically, or both, does not necessarily mean a change in sexual attraction or desire, but may influence their behavior or how they identify. So thinking about transgender bodies, which are often a point of fixation when thinking about trans identities, we need to remember that being trans is not just about bodies. And many of us have probably heard this sort of narrative of being born in the quote-unquote wrong body, which is a very real experience for a lot of people, and many people from very young ages feel a deep discomfort or dysphoria with the body that they have, but that it's really less about, for some people, it's less about being struggling with the body itself rather than feeling trapped by social beliefs about bodies that are often hard to disentangle from one another. And so many trans people do feel a deep discomfort with their body, although some don't feel as deep a discomfort. Often it is really linked to the social beliefs about what bodies are or can be and what bodies mean in terms of gender that is really feeling feeding and these feelings of dysphoria. And so when we think about transition, transition is for some people a medical process, although not everyone wants to modify their body in some way, but it is often a social process, it's a psychological process, but it's also a collective process. It's a thing that the person who is trans-identified will transition, but that also involves a transition of the community around them, whether that's a family, whether it's a biological family, family of origin, or friends or coworkers. So it's not an isolated thing. You can't just transition by yourself because we are social beings and we move through the world as social beings. When we think about transgender bodies, or we think about transition in particular, we also think about some of the privilege that's involved in that. And so you may have heard the term stealth or to pass. So somebody who is stealth, that's one way of describing somebody who is transgender but who's not open or is not very vocal about their trans identity. That may be for safety reasons. That may be just because they feel like that's a private identity that other people don't need to know. And that is somewhat related to, but not the same as passing. So this is a term that folks have borrowed from communities of color. So folks who are trans can sometimes pass as if they are cisgender. So I am one of those persons who has passing privilege. And so for many people, if I don't tell them that I am transgender, they don't know that about me, because when they look at me, they believe that I am cisgender because they don't have indicators that tell them otherwise. And the idea that somebody can quote unquote look trans is also a little bit problematic and something that needs to be thought about and critically, but being able to pass as if you are not transgender does provide some level of privilege, and so having questions about who can pass or who is able to be stealth, who wants to, and whether that is even a desirable thing for an individual, and in what context that might be possible. Another important thing to know about transition is I like to talk about transition like a buffet. There's so many different options to choose from, and we'll look at some of those on the next slide. And everybody on some level gets to decide what they want. So everybody's transition might look different. Some people might want hormones, some people might not want hormones, some people might want surgery, some might not want surgery, and everybody really gets to decide what's best for them in terms of how they want their body or their experience to be as a trans person in terms of what pieces they want to have in terms of their transition, certainly for medically or legally in terms of names changes and things like that. However, even though everybody can decide what they want and that thing may change over time, wanting something is not the same as being able to get that something. And so there are many structural constraints on getting certainly medical transition care, thinking about cost, the availability of competent providers, but also even social or legal things have costs to them, whether they are financial costs or social costs. And so not everybody has those things available. And a great resource if you're interested in some of the issues and things that impact trans people and some of the ways in which being able to get access to certain things or having access to certain things, you can think about take a look at the National Center for Trans Equality, which is transequality.org. Has a great list of resources about that. But since this week we're specifically talking about bodies, I want to talk a little bit more about trans body work. And so here are some common medical and or non-medical body modification or bodywork pieces that trans women might undergo. Some folks might want hormones, breast implants, electrolysis to remove hair on the face or arms or other parts of the body. Some trans women will have a surgical procedure that reduces the prominence of their Adam's apple. There's a variety of bottom surgery options to create a vagina and more female-looking genitals. Trans women might also engage in sort of facial reconstruction surgery, so what it would be colloquially called a nose job or something with their cheekbones. But there's also a lot of these non-medical things around makeup and shaving and making your hips look bigger or making your waist look smaller or whatever it is to create a more feminine appearance if that is desirable. On the other side of things, again, thinking still in a little bit more in terms of binary, trans men might want hormones, have top surgery or a mastectomy. They might have a hysterectomy to remove their female reproductive organs, might engage, want a variety of bottom surgeries that are more or less sort of just allowing a more natural enlarged clitoris as a result of hormones to be a little bit more freer, but all the way up to a full penile construction, closing the vaginal canal, all sorts of different options there. Again, some non-medical interventions around weightlifting or trying to bulk up and create a more masculine appearance through working out, and of course body hair maintenance as one way of presenting a more masculine appearance. And so some people will want to do all of these, some people will want none of these things, and for folks who are maybe more non-binary or want a more androgynous appearance, they may engage in some of these or to a lesser degree, right? Hormones can be done in smaller or larger doses to either do some masculinizing, some feminizing, depending on what that person is interested in. And if you have a competent and affirming provider, they can help folks sort of really figure out what is going to be best for them in terms of the way that they feel most comfortable and would like to express themselves. Also want to talk a little bit, because this is a sexuality and society class, about the relationship between trans or intersex identities and sexuality. So like cisgender folks or non-trans folks, each person is different and everyone has slightly different experiences or needs around their sexuality or their sexual desire. But so thinking about desire or sexual attraction, this may or may not change with transition or an awareness of being intersex or an awareness of a trans identity, but it could, right? Especially with things like hormones that are very linked to our sex drives and sexual functioning, that putting or taking away or doing things with hormones may influence the person's desire or attraction, of how much desire or attraction they have, who they're desiring or attracted to, and so forth. We can also think about in terms of identity. So regardless of whether the attraction or the desire piece changes, there's usually some sort of adjustment of how people identify. And intersex folks might identify with many different identities that will depend on their own understanding of their bodies and attraction, especially because of the way we define sexual orientation as related to gender, which is often linked to bodies. But trans folks often will have some sort of adjustment or recalibration of their identity as well. For example, if you have a trans woman who is attracted to women before her transition, and she still is attracted to women after her transition, she may adjust her sexual identity from being a straight person to being lesbian or bisexual or pansexual. And so things like that, because the gender identity has shifted or changed in some way, or perhaps the social legibility, social reading of that gender, folks may adjust how they label themselves, but they might not. And certainly thinking about sexual behavior, if sexual behavior, sexual encounters, folks may be more comfortable with their sexuality because they feel more comfortable in their body or in their identity. And for all folks, communication is really important when we're talking about sex and sexual encounters, but especially for trans folks and folks whose bodies don't necessarily fit what we presume they will look like based on meeting them. And so lots of communication spaces that are important. So for trans people, thinking about when you meet people, how you meet people, are you going to come out as trans, or perhaps if you identify as intersex, are you going to come out in some way while you're actually having sex? What does communication and consent look like? What is okay? What is off limits? What feels good? What does sex look like if it doesn't look like this stereotypical heteronormative sexual encounter? And remembering that it's not just about genitals, that it's also sex is about so many different parts of our bodies. And for trans people, the body dysmorphia or discomfort with our bodies might not just be linked to our genitals. It might be linked to other parts of our bodies as well. And so really being in communication and having good understanding of one's own self, but also being able to communicate that with a partner and having that partner listen. And so, of course, always in sexual encounters, consent is important, but the way that communication happens and the need for different types of communication is often present for trans and or intersex or non-binary folks.